Der Siebenpfeiffer-Preis zeichnet Journalistinnen und Journalisten aus, die sich für die freiheitlichen Grundrechte und die demokratischen Grundwerte in herausragender Weise engagieren, ohne dabei auf ihre eigene Karriere Rücksicht zu nehmen. Es kann gar keinen Zweifel daran geben, dass Glenn Greenwald, der Preisträger in diesem Jahr, diese Kriterien in herausragender Weise erfüllt. Er steht in der Tradition der großen demokratischen Aufklärer, der streitbaren Publizisten, die sich nicht einschüchtern und schon gar nicht mundtot machen lassen. Die heutige Preisverleihung hat deshalb eine klare Botschaft: Politische Freiheit ist nicht selbstverständlich. Demokratie kennt keinen Schaukelstuhl. Und politische Freiheit und Demokratie müssen immer wieder erneut verteidigt und erkämpft werden. Beides ist kein Thema für das Geschichtsmuseum. 2013 ist Glenn Greenwald dem amerikanischen Whistleblower Edward Snowden begeben, hat dabei geholfen, eine große Menge geheimen Materials öffentlich zu machen. Material, das belegt, wie umfassend Geheimdienste in der Lage sind, unsere Kommunikation aufzuzeichnen und auszuwerten. Seine Geschichte kennt inzwischen die ganze Welt. Wer wie Edward Snowden, Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras und ihre Mitstreiter diesem Gegner zutraut, in einer Sekunde, 1 Billion Versuche zum Knacken eines Passworts zu unternehmen, den schrecken wohl die Gefahren für die eigene Karriere nicht allzu sehr. Denn in Anbetracht dessen hat man, ich glaube, das kann man von Glenn Greenwald sagen, eine eigene Mission. Ich möchte dafür bedanken, Mr. Greenwald, dass Sie zu uns gekommen sind, dass Sie diese gewaltige Arbeit immer wieder von Neuem anpacken. Es ist mir eine große Ehre, dass ich für Sie heute hier sprechen durfte. Alles Gute für Sie und für alles Gute für die, die Ihre Arbeit unterstützen. Herzlichen Dank.
Such an inspiring award. Like all awards, it's one that I share with my incredibly brave and brilliant colleague Laura Poitras, who moved to Germany and lived in Berlin for the last 3 years because she feared the steps that her own government would take. And it's an award that I share as well with my incredibly brave source, Edward Snowden, who has genuinely inspired millions and millions of people around the world with his noble act of conscience. One of the real benefits of receiving awards that honor people who have used freedom of the press historically is that it gives you an opportunity to understand the value of freedom of the press, not just for ourselves, but how it's been used over the years. And one of the things that strikes me about the Siebenpfeifer example is that it shows that the model of a free press that predominates today is not the only model, and in fact, it's a very recent invention. The idea of freedom of the press was never that it was going to be something practiced by a small, cloistered profession called journalists, who need lots of money in order to do it, and therefore have to work for large corporations, and therefore have to adopt the value that corporations normally have, which is avoiding controversy, avoiding alienating those who are in power, adopting a posture of contrived neutrality and objectivity so as not to upset anybody. This was never how freedom of the press from the beginning was conceived. It was actually quite the opposite. Freedom of the press was intended to be an instrument that all citizens could use, not just a small group of people called journalists, but all citizens could use to work against the interests of those who wield the greatest power, to expose their deceit, to shine a light on that which they were trying to hide, to inform their fellow citizens about what those people in power were intending to do. That was really the way that freedom of the press was first conceived when it was talked about centuries ago. And it was grounded in this Enlightenment idea, this realization about the nature of institutional power and how human beings will exercise that power. And this awareness was grounded in the principle that if we're going to organize a state, a centralized authority, a government, and vest political power in human beings, it is inevitable, not likely, not probable, but inevitable that that power will be abused. Sometimes the power will be abused simply because evil people attain that power. But in far more frequent instances, it will be because ordinary, well-intentioned people acquire that power and succumb to the temptations which as human beings we're all vulnerable to abuse that power. And one alternative would be to say, well, we're simply not going to have a state. We're simply not going to vest political power, and anybody will live in a state of anarchy. But very few people think that's a viable option. And so there's really only one option that's available to us to address that problem. And that is to ensure that there are means that exist to impose limits, to impose checks on what those who wield the greatest power can do. And one of the most important limits that exists in democracy for limiting how power can be abused is a free press. And in order for that to be meaningful, in order for that to function properly, the press cannot be a partner of or a collaborator with those who wield the greatest power. It cannot be devoted to amplifying their message or to promoting their agenda and interests. It has to instead be an adversary to those who wield the greatest power, to be devoted to examining and investigating the claims that it makes to the public, to uncovering exactly which those who wield the greatest power want to conceal. We were going to be extremely careful and responsible in what we did, and to this day, the vast majority of the documents that Edward Snowden has taken are documents that we still have not published, largely at his request and because of our responsibility as journalists not to endanger people. But what we did know we were going to do, and what we purposely set out to do, was to make sure that the world understood exactly what was being done to one of the most important inventions in human history, the internet, and to make sure that they knew that the government was doing exactly that which it was trying to hide. And we understood that it was very important to realize and to accept from the start that all of us were going to be attacked if we did this. And that instead of being frightened by or deterred by threats that these governments were going to make, or calls for our imprisonment, or the invasion of our newsrooms, or the detention of our partners, and all of the other things that the US and the British government and their allies in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have tried to do to prevent the story, that instead we were going to view those threats as a testament to the fact that we were doing our job as journalists. And that if you do your job as journalists, if you don't just say that you want to challenge those who wield the greatest power, but you actually do so, that the inevitable cost of doing that is that they will try and attack you and frighten you and scare you. And it was very important that we all together, not just the three of us in Hong Kong, but our fellow journalists and editors at The Guardian and here in Germany at Der Spiegel and around the world, decided that we would view those threats as a badge of honor. And that is why I'm so honored to receive an award that is designed to commemorate journalists from many, many years ago who did the same thing, who viewed threats from the monarch and ultimately their own imprisonment as evidence that they were performing the noblest act of journalism, which is to inform their fellow citizens of that which the great people who wield the greatest power are trying to hide. Now, one of the most common sentiments that you hear when people try to claim that privacy isn't really that important, and I'm sure you've all heard it, everybody in this room, many times, maybe some of you even say it, is, well, I don't actually think privacy is really that important because I don't do anything wrong, and therefore I wouldn't really mind if the BND or the government or other agencies around the world read what I do. I'm a pretty boring, uninteresting, unthreatening person, and I really don't mind if they go ahead and read it. Now, everybody who says that, it's very easy to say it, but everybody who says it doesn't actually mean that. They don't really believe it. And the way that I know that nobody really believes it is that everybody takes all kinds of steps to protect their own privacy. We all have things to hide. We all put passwords on our email and social media accounts. We put locks on our bedroom and our bathroom doors. Every single time somebody has said to me, I really don't care if my privacy is being violated because I'm doing nothing wrong and I have nothing to hide, I always say the same thing, which is I get out a pen and I write down my email address and I say, here's my email address. When you get home, I want you to email to me all of the passwords to your email and social media accounts. Not just the respectable ones in your name, but all the ones that you use, so that I can just troll through it at will and publish whatever I find interesting. And to this day, essentially, almost without exception, nobody has taken me up on that offer. That email location is a very, very desolate place. Now, I just want to end by talking a little bit about the person who you just saw on video, Edward Snowden, and I just want to make a couple of points about him. And the first point I want to make is one that I actually made directly to the Vice Chancellor prior to his leaving, and it's one that I was hoping to make while I stood here, but one that I will make again to him directly since he gave me a way to contact him. But not just him, but lots of other officials inside of Germany. There have been a lot of really inspiring things that have happened as a result of the Edward Snowden disclosures. An incredibly significant debate around the world. I live in Brazil, where this story was one of the leading stories over the last 2 years. People have debated the value of digital privacy for the first time, the threat posed by government secrecy, the role of journalism. But one of the really disappointing things that has happened is that the countries and governments that have benefited the most by the sacrifice that Edward Snowden has made are the same countries and the same governments that have very disgracefully turned their back on him at his greatest time of need. And what I find remarkable is that the government of this country and the government of several other countries has benefited greatly from what it is that he did. The Chancellor of this country learned about the way in which our own private communications has been targeted. The institutions of this country learned about vulnerabilities to their own communication security of which they were previously unaware. The population of this country learned that it is subjected to and targeted with programs of mass surveillance, all of which this country learned about as a result of the sacrifice made by Edward Snowden and the risks that he took to his own life and to the government of this country and the governments of other countries has refused to do for Edward Snowden what he did for them, which is take small risks in order to protect his political rights the way that he took risks to protect their political rights, and has instead, and I think history will view this very shamefully, left it to a tiny band of powerless countries in Latin America and Vladimir Putin's Russia to do what those governments should be doing and have the legal, moral, and ethical obligation to do, which is offer asylum to Edward Snowden. Is that Any human institution that is built by human beings, no matter how formidable it may seem, can be undermined or modified or torn down and replaced by other human beings whenever there's the necessary courage and the necessary will. And for me, that can only happen if we have the information that we need to have to make ourselves aware of what is being done in the world. And that's why freedom of the press is such a viable and crucial value, and it's why I'm really honored to receive an award like this designed to protect it. Thank you very much again. Appreciate it.